Hello and welcome back. I'm making this video to walk you through a couple of slides that I made for my last class, but then they're adaptations of pretty much every class that I do. It introduces you to some terms that I may slip in here in terms of when I uh, when I introduce you to units or when I try to tie things together either in lecture or in setting things up. So I have a couple of things here. You'll see that I have. Oh, let me go back real quick, so that you kind of know what I'm working from. Okay, so we have critical thinking and culture and introduction. It's adapted from a couple of books, one of which is your book that you're looking at probably either as we speak or very shortly, either through my links or through the book itself. So I'm gonna give you a couple of terms out here, throw them at you to see if they're terms that you might be able to work with, and I'm hoping that it'll help you out and understand sort of how I introduce concepts. So we have rules of behavior. One of the things to understand about critical thinking and critical reading and writing is that we're sort of governed by certain rules of behavior that we that we can't really help that too much. It's in many ways cultural. They're the norms, the expectations that we have going into a class. And I'm introducing you to these terms not to critique them necessarily, at least not yet, but to let you guys know that I understand that you're coming in from with different perspectives and different understandings about sort of how the world works. Okay, that's important, and that's we need to acknowledge that, especially now. But we do need to understand that we can maybe generalize some of the terms a little bit in terms of the how, right? That how that we were talking about before in terms of rhetoric. It's not just sort of what the message is, it's how that message is governed. And that takes on a variety of forms. So as you can see, there's some we must think deeply about rules that govern our behavior. It's important for critical thinking, and it allows us to question the world and to understand that we act according to social norms. And social norms are things that can change, right? Um, and in some periods it changes faster than others. Right now, our social norms are changing in a lot of ways, right? And how we're receiving information, has changed, and all of those lead to different behaviors, right? And so how we access information has really sort of changed not only the message that's being put out there, but also how our social norms and behaviors are being built. Because these are very social in nature, right? They can change, and to acknowledge that is good, right? It's a good thing to critically evaluate how we receive information. Okay, so I'll just leave it to you to sort of pause if you need to look at these. If I'm clicking through these too quickly, some terms that I think would be helpful that may slip into my conversation is that a norm is are widely held cultural ideas. A social script is a set of behavioral instructions. And culture is guided by these ideas, and we are guided by culture. Okay, so it's a lot to unpack there, right? A social script is a norm is something that we think of as normal. And I put that in quotes, right? Because normal is really just what we want to accept as sort of the baseline, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody abides by it and it defines everybody. It just means that is a norm. That's just something that we consider quote unquote normal, right? And even if we rebel against it, we're still rebelling against that norm, right? So the definition doesn't necessarily have to change and we can still sort of criticize it. But then on top of that, we have a social script that we follow based on these norms. So if we think of a social script as literally a script that we have when we come into any situation where we're being guided by culture, a social script would be, when you walk into a classroom, and we don't have a classroom per se, but when you introduce yourself into a classroom, you have certain expectations about what that means, right? You are the student, I am the teacher. There's scripts that we're guided by, right? I wouldn't treat you the same way you say, Mr. Sanchez, maybe you use Mr. And you know that's sort of a norm that is guiding the script that we're running across, right? So there's sort of this unspoken understanding that my role and how I communicate is in some ways not necessarily limited, but guided by certain concepts. So every time I say something instructive, I'm the teacher, so you take that as part of the script that we're engaging in, right? I present to you information as a teacher, and it follows a certain script. I can't just sort of, you can't just dismiss it like you would in other capacities. So think of it as we're engaged in these roles, and those roles define sort of how we communicate and how we negotiate these norms. Okay, so other terms that you can maybe understand later on, not necessarily now. You don't have to understand all of these now. But if I do slip these in, I will offer you some definitions for these. I'm not going to necessarily go over all of these, but just in case I do identify something as a rhetorical situation, it's really just saying that there's a moment where there's an issue of communication going on, right? There's a situation that can be evaluated in terms of rhetorical guidelines. Okay, so a piece of paper, if you write something on a piece of paper, right, the fact that it's being placed on a paper as opposed to being spoken defines that rhetorical situation. I have to read it and sort of evaluate it mentally, right? But if you're just talking to me, then I accept that as a different kind of rhetorical situation. So all of these things are entwined in that sense. In that we can have the same message, but depending on how it's communicated, it could define different things about that rhetorical situation. Okay, so roles is also following that idea of the script. We have those roles, and we have cultural beliefs that we hold on to, that we have as we engage in these roles. Identity and narrative, I will go over those a little bit later because that's a lot to unpack sort of in a little short video. This is a little bit more information about rhetorical situation, what you should look for when you're evaluating something, any piece of writing in this case, or even just, any rhetorical situation, right? You can look for these things and note, for example, I'm going to 3 examples of rhetorical strategies employed within an essay, right? If you're reading an essay, there may be some rhetorical strategies that's engaging in, right? It may be talking to a particular kind of audience, right? So it has certain expectations about vocabulary level or pre-understanding, right? Some stats that, maybe the essay's not going to go over because it just kind of assumes that anybody that's reading this would understand it, right? So some of those things are just rhetorical strategies. If it's a humorous essay versus a very serious, statistically heavy essay, right? Not that those two things can't go together, but it's just something, these are just different ways that we can sort of guess at what sort of the ultimate goal is. What is the overall rhetorical situation that we're evaluating. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Examples of rhetoric in academic writing. We can think of these examples as the ones that you're being presented with. Academic writing is pretty much anything that's elevated at least to the point of understanding that in an academic setting there's certain expectations that are being presented, right? An essay is expected to have some kind of thesis, right? Unless it really doesn't, and then if it doesn't, it should have a really good reason for that, right? Because the expectation is still there because it is academic writing, right? Steps to analyze a rhetorical situation involve questioning the author, the audience, yourself, right? You're the audience, right? What do I bring to the table? What biases do I have, right? The context that the piece of the rhetorical situation is embedded within, what genre, and by genre I mean what are the more specific set of expectations, right? Genre is usually used in terms of like sci-fi or westerns, right? And that is maybe a helpful way of understanding genre. The genre of academic writing has a certain very specific set of expectations, like I talked about before. But like if you think of it in terms of sci-fi, right? What do you expect when it says here? If I had to do a book and said this is a sci-fi book, right? And it had a bunch of like people riding on horses and out in the old west, and and there's a sheriff in town, and it's like, wait a minute, this kind of reads like a western, right? What would you be waiting for? You're waiting for like ray guns or time travel or something, right? that genre, the genre is defined by these expectations. And that might be a way of looking at it. When you're reading a sci-fi book, you expect sci-fi elements at some point, right? If you're reading a Western, you expect Western elements, right? Quote unquote. Okay, so rules, norms, and social scripts are a little bit more specific ways of looking at those things that I talked about before in terms of the role that we play and social scripts. And then the argument itself is something that you can look at. Okay, what is the argument? What is the basis for all of this information maybe that you've gained? Okay, and a little additional note that we slip in and out of different roles. Roles are not static. Okay, so if you enter into my classroom as a student, you have that's a role that you're assuming. It doesn't mean you're going to stay a student like when you go home, right? Hopefully you don't, right? Or if you do, that might be a good idea. I don't know, just as a general concept. But when you talk to your friends, you're not going to talk the same way as you would in your role as a student, right? Well, hopefully you won't, I guess. That's a way to look at that. Is that there's fluidity involved here. Okay. So and then a little preview and or review depending on where you are in the book about the first 11 pages. There's some information about annotating and questioning. It begins with a one way of looking at it is it begins with a dialogue between you, the reader, and the author. Okay. Book excerpt from World of Ideas provides examples of annotation using the prints. Okay. So annotating and questioning begins the dialogue. Maybe I should be a little more specific on that in terms of the, right? There you go. The dialogue between you and the reader, okay? You, the reader, and the author, okay? So understanding that there's a dialogue in place whenever you enter into a piece of writing is probably pretty helpful. You don't have to be conscious of it at all times, but it is something to be aware of. And then finally, in this little excerpt, it does identify ways to review a reading, and then forming your own ideas, which is kind of ultimately what we're getting at, right? And ideas are formed, and a critical evaluation is formed based on the evidence you're presenting, right? Because in some cases, I assign you a reading, you read it, and then you use that as the evidence for expanding upon certain ideas, right? Maybe you're questioning the nature of the argument. That's a pretty broad, that's a much broader understanding than just telling me, okay, what did it say, right? What is the author's argument, right? That's step one. Saying what you think about the argument is sort of step two, right? But basing that opinion on evidence that's presented in the essay is sort of the glue that holds everything together, right? So you can look at it initially as sort of as basic as that, right? Forming your own ideas is to identify ways to review readings and understand readings so that you can do it in an academic and more formal setting. Okay, so I hope that helps. And if this all seems a little bit confusing at this point, it's because maybe we haven't worked with a lot of these terms. So don't think that just because I'm maybe moving a little bit fast that we're not going to return to all of these ideas. This is just my way of giving you an expansive, sort of a slightly more expansive universe so that you understand a little bit more about what we're engaging in, but don't be fearful of the information because I will walk you through it much more deliberately than I'm able to do it right now, okay? So I'm only giving this to you so that you are aware that you're going to be responsible for some of this stuff as I introduce it later, okay? So hopefully that helps, and don't freak out. Everything will be all right. I will help you. Mr. Sanchez will help you along. Okay, so I'll make it easy, as easy as I possibly can for you. Okay? All right, talk to you later.